everybody. I'm Maria Carreira from the National Heritage Language Resource Center at UCLA. And in this presentation, I like to share some basic elements of project-based learning with you, some sample projects, and some ideas about how to make your teaching come alive in the classroom. That is one of the things I love most about PBL, that students really respond in an engaging manner because PBL is about using language in the real world. But that's not the only thing I love about PBL. PBL actually checks a lot of boxes in language teaching. It works well for HL teaching and learning and also for mixed classes, though I won't have time to talk about mixed classes in this presentation. It's also very good for language learning and teaching and learning in general, not just HL teaching. And it's great for remote learning, such an important topic for us right now. Regarding HL teaching, heritage language teaching, there are three must-dos of heritage language teaching. In the area of language, it's important to expand students' functional abilities. Heritage language learners are students who grow up speaking a language at home. When they come to the classroom, they come to us with pretty good skills already. And so the goal is to expand their skills and their ability to communicate themselves in different contexts and situations. PBL does that really well. A second must-do of heritage language teaching is to attend to the social affective needs of heritage language learners, which are different from those of second language learners. In particular, it's important to respond to their motivations, their goals, and their life experiences with respect to the heritage language and culture. PBL also does that very well. Regarding the third point, PBL is ideal for learner-centered instruction, as I will show you later. Learner-centered instruction starts with the learner, seeks to address the needs of the learner. It is not curriculum focused. Looking now at what language learning in general is gained by using PBL, I'm going to show you using arrows all the advantages that PBL presents with respect to what ACTFL, the American Council of the Teaching of Foreign Languages, considers are the best teaching practices of today. First of all, as you can see in the first arrow, PBL provides opportunities for learners to use language beyond the classroom. It more generally connected to that, students learn language learn to use the language rather than to learn about the language, as was done in previous years. PBL, as I also mentioned, is learner-centered, where the learner takes charge of what happens in the classroom and the teacher acts as a facilitator or collaborator. PBL also is based on thematic units and makes extensive use or requires making extensive use of authentic resources. In PBL, the learner is the doer and the creator of language, not the instructor. In PBL, language is also used as a vehicle to teach academic content. And so that is another way in which it connects to real life. And finally, in PBL, whatever products are created, I'll explain what products are shortly, they are directed at real audiences consisting of native speakers in the real world. That's exactly what the products in PBL do. There are other points here that I will be addressing as I move forward with this presentation. Moving to remote learning, we can see that PBL uses technology, needs technology to work. So even if you were in a face-to-face content, in PBL, it's really essential to use authentic materials. And that's where technology works really well, where technology presents a big advantage over the old-fashioned way of getting authentic models, which was by physically collecting them. I will be addressing this more near the end of this presentation. Why does all this matter? Why have I gone through this before actually getting into a description of what PBL is? Well, because these are essential considerations as you consider designing your own projects. You need to think about what the best practices are that you are enacting as you design your projects. Equally important, it's valuable to know these practices of PBL and how they relate to the best practices of language teaching and heritage language teaching, because many programs are still reluctant to try something like PBL. So if you want to become a leader in PBL, if you want to make the case to your colleagues in your departments about the value of PBL, these are important elements to know. For instructors, I have to add, PBL has another huge advantage, that it's always interesting. If you have used a textbook more than a few times, you know how boring it can get after a while to keep doing the same thing semester after semester, year after year, right? With PBL, it can change from one semester to another. So you're always learning something new. You, as the instructor, don't have to keep saying, how many times am I going to be repeating this? It all of a sudden refreshes your attitude towards teaching. At least that's been my experience. Another experience I've had is that it's made me younger, fitter, and sexier. Joke, right? But I really do love it. So with that, let's move to project-based learning. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the essential elements of it, show you a few sample projects as I move along to illustrate those essential elements, and then return in more detail to how PBL really instantiates some of the best things we know about how languages are learned. So let's get to the elements first. Before I describe those elements, I want to tell you a little bit about where you can learn a lot more about those elements as well as other things. It's the Buck Institute for Education. It's a great website on PBL, very complete with lots of presentations, lots of sample projects, lots of ideas. The only caveat is that it doesn't have a lot of information specific to language learning. And so whatever you find there about how to design a project for social sciences, let's say, you're going to have to adapt to language teaching. And that is how this presentation will help you, because it will help you think about any other projects you see for teaching other content areas, how to structure those projects so that your students can also learn language in the process. What is PBL? Well, the Buck Institute of Education gives the following definition. In red, I am highlighting the key points that I'm going to be returning to on a regular basis in this presentation. It is a learner-centered teaching approach in which students work over a period of time on a task which involves engaging with complex issues, solving problems, or meeting particular real-life challenges. To communicate their learning, students develop a product such as timelines, blogs, brochures, reports, public service announcements, etc. So in a nutshell, you have all the elements there of PBL. Let's look at them more closely. ACTFL, the smart brief from ACTFL, gives a perfect real-life example of a project. And in this story from the Dallas Morning newspaper, the Dallas Morning News that they forwarded with the smart brief, they describe a project carried out at home with a mother that was Hispanic and her children, where they created a bilingual book during the early stages of the pandemic, where they address all sorts of questions that they had about the pandemic, feelings that they had about it, fears, actions they could take to protect themselves and to grow in this situation. They researched all of this and actually published a book, a children's book, a bilingual children's book that you can find on Amazon and buy on Amazon.com. This is a real project. Notice it doesn't happen in the classroom, it happened in a home. Elements of this project, are they good? Absolutely. Notice it's learner-centered. It's not something that mattered to the teacher or even the mom. It was something that the children were concerned with, right? It was also an extended work as opposed to a little task they completed in one day. They must have done a lot of research. They must have had a lot of drafts of this book, gone back and forth as to how to present different things. That is an essential element of PBL. They also learn key knowledge and success skills. They learn how to research things. They learn how to illustrate a book. They learn how to self-publish a book. They learn writing skills in a book, etc. So notice this was not created to practice language, even though they actually did because it's a bilingual book, but it was created to address a real world need. And in the process, they learn key knowledge and success skills as well as language, but not in isolation. Regarding key knowledge, understanding, and success skills is at the center of PBL. This is a wheel produced by the Buck Institute of Education. And you can see that all the elements of PBL revolve around this idea that in working on a project, students are to develop key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. And I'll be showing you examples of this as I go along. But notice what the point I want to make right now is that the fundamental idea is that you're going to develop these key academic abilities, not language, although you will develop language in the process. Is this a real life challenge? Absolutely. It's not a made up activity to practice language. It addressed something that was very real and unfortunately continues to be real to this day, the pandemic. And finally, is it performance-based or knowledge-based? And to give you just a little bit of what the difference is between performance-based assessment or knowledge-based assessment, let me use this graph. Knowledge-based is what your students come into the classroom with, knowledge. When you assess to figure out what it is that they come into the classroom for, what they can do on their own, in other words, without any instruction, you are testing their knowledge. And you're typically doing it to place them in a course. The actual Proficiency, or the OPI, is an example of knowledge-based assessment. PBL, on the other hand, is based on performance. And performance is what students can do after carefully planned instruction, the use of rehearsed language, and with the help of the instructor taking the role as a facilitator or a coach. You can see that the book that the children created is performance-based assessment if we were going to give them a grade, because it is something that they were guided by the mother to create. It is not something they could have done on their own. Had they been able to do that on their own, it would be knowledge-based assessment. Let me move now to some more sample projects. I'm going to start with a project from a class that I teach for heritage language learners. It's the first course in a sequence of 3 courses that we offer for heritage language learners. It's at the college level, and my students typically are at the intermediate, low to intermediate mid level of ACTFL. I'll explain that in a second. What I want to highlight as I describe this project to you is the notion of authenticity, which is so important in PBL. The Buck Institute of Education tells us that a project has real-world context if it uses real-world processes, tools, and quality standards, makes a real impact, and/or is connected to students' own concerns, interests, and identity. Why is authenticity so important? Because the research that has been done on PBL shows that this is the most commonly cited positive outcome of project work. Students really find the authenticity of PBL to be engaging and to make them want to learn the target language. This is an example of a project created for my 250 class. The way this was created was the students come to my class, and I divide them up into groups according to their interests, their future professional interests. Keep in mind, these are college students. A good number of the students that come to me, to this class, want to be Spanish teachers at the high school level. Those students created this poster. Before I tell you a little bit more about the poster, let me say that by no means are all students looking to become Spanish teachers. I get a lot of students in the health professions, students in journalism, students in business that are Spanish speakers and want to use those skills in the real world. Getting back to this project, what is it? It's a flow chart that describes the process to follow to get a credential, in the single subject credential in Spanish, and that's what is required to teach at the high school level. This flow chart is specific to the California situation. Now, the reason why this was created is because my students were given the following instructions. Find a real problem that you can solve within the field of study or profession that you are interested in. Asked to do that, the students got in contact with Cynthia Leathers. You can see her email down here. She's a single subject advisor for foreign languages in our department. They talked to her, and Cynthia told them that one of the most difficult problems she faces is that this is rather a complicated process, a sequence of steps that students have to take in order to obtain their credential. And that students frequently got very flustered when they realized that they had skipped a step and now had to go back to a step that they were not aware of that was required previously. And so working with Cynthia, the students came up with this idea of creating a poster. By the way, this is a huge, huge poster, and displaying this huge poster with all the steps clearly outlined, all the information that students need to know. You can see that this is a very useful and real project. The language is fairly simple, although it doesn't look like it. I'll get to how to judge the simplicity level of the language or the difficulty level of a language in a second. Before I do that, I want to describe 2 other projects so that you get an idea of the kinds of things students produce in this class. I have students in this class also. I had a group of students that were interested in becoming, well, either state or federal court interpreters. And so they produce something like a flow chart about this also very complicated process where the development of language skills is important, but also the understanding of the resources that are there, the requirements, etc. And again, I sent them to work with a professor in our department who's an expert on this topic to learn about the most important things that they need to know about, as well as the audience who would consume this flow chart would need to know about. Another project was the creation of a glossary of dialectal/regional medical terms. The way this project came about was because I had had a conversation with a neighbor who's a doctor, an English speaker. He had been taking Spanish to help his Spanish speaking patients. And one day he came up to me and he said, Maria, I don't know what to do. I've been studying Spanish for so long, but I cannot communicate very well with my patients. What can I do? What's going on? So after talking to him, I realized that what was going on was that he had been taking and learning technical medical vocabulary in Spanish, but his patients were frequently using regional, dialectal, and even Spanglish, a combination of English and Spanish, when speaking to him. And so the language that he had been learning in a formal context in school was not really helping him in the real world. So working with this doctor friend of mine, my students who were interested in the medical field produced this glossary, which had standard English terminology, standard Spanish terminology. Notice these two things are really important for my students to learn if they want to practice medicine or nursing or whatever in the real world. And in addition, it included dialectal or regional medical terms. That's also important for practicing medicine in Southern California and probably anywhere else in the United States, right? In order to do the first two, the standard terms, my students had to consult standard dictionaries as well as work with my doctor friend. And in order to do the third one, they had to interview community members, family members, each other, to try to figure out what the most common regional and medical terms that my doctor friend would need to know in order to practice his profession. All of these were very successful projects. And notice they're all learner-centered, of course, because they were difficult. They also involved extended work. They developed a lot of key knowledge and success skills, how to interview somebody else, for example, to try to get a feel for what is needed, and then to develop a plan of how to go about addressing that need. Very much a real life challenge in all cases, and performance-based, because they all created projects that were then assessed based on how well they solve the problem that they set out to address. Now, it's possible as you're listening to me, you're saying, oh, this is great, but seriously, my students cannot do that. That is much too hard. That's a very common perception. And I find that at the root of that perception is the idea that real life problems usually require higher order tasks, not simple tasks. And the sense is that you can't do that if you don't have much language, if you are at the lower levels of proficiency. Is that actually true? Well, maybe not. In order to demonstrate that, I'd like to give you a very quick overview of the actual proficiency levels. Just a skeletal, really, overview. At the novice level, we find that students produce words and phrases and formulaic language that is already existent. They're not creating with language. It's at the intermediate level when students start to create with language and they start to form loosely connected sentences that start to resemble something like a paragraph. At the advanced level, the creation of good paragraphs congeals, right? And that's when they're actually starting to write in a way that resembles more what happens in maybe an essay. And also at this level, they can handle a complication. This will become important very soon. You'll see why. Finally, at the superior level, they can create a series of paragraphs to give a sense of connected discourse, or if you're writing pages in an essay or term papers. As you all know, there's another level, the distinguished level. I'm not including it here because really it's not something we deal with typically in education. So to give you, to go back to this point of task, higher order task, not being doable with low proficiency, remember, I'm going to counter that idea. I want to set up a situation. Suppose you are asked the question that's there, the very first question that's there. How cognitively challenging is this to answer, and how linguistically challenging is it? The question is, list 4 adjectives that describe you. Pick 2 that are strengths of yours and 2 that could be considered flaws. How cognitively challenging is this? Very, especially if you're doing this in a job interview, because you don't just want to be truthful in the flaws that you reveal. You want to be very strategic in the flaws that you reveal, as well as the strengths that you reveal. You want to focus on those strengths that make you look like a good candidate for a position. Is this a real question? Absolutely. If you go online and you look up the most common questions in job interviews, you will see that this is a typical question. Now, how linguistically challenging is this? Well, notice adjectives are one-word answers, right? And you're not creating really with language. And so it's at the one-word level, the novice level. So this is not all that linguistically challenging. Really, all you need is a dictionary to find these adjectives. So what is the point I'm making? We can engage students in complex activities that are authentic, that happen in the real world, with relatively simple language. This means you can do PBL at the lowest levels of instruction. Another factor that you have to take into consideration about how doable is a project is that PBL happens here at the performance level. It's what students can do with your help, with carefully planned instruction, careful scaffolding of sequence of tasks. And so it's not knowledge-based, but it's performance-based. So if you structure the project well, you can get a good product at the end, even if your students are at very low proficiency levels. Bottom line is, we can do it. PBL is doable really at all levels. The key to making it doable is to carefully follow these 3 steps. Step number 1, decide on a theme and a problem. Step number 2, determine the final outcome. In step number 3, structure the project. I'm now going to describe each of these. Let me use a sample project to do that. This project comes from a different class, Spanish 315, which is a course on professional Spanish, and it's the first course in a certificate that we offer on professional Spanish. This project, I'm just going to call it the CV project, involves creating a professional portfolio. All right. So, and that is a CV, a curriculum or resume, a cover letter, a job interview, and a professional video, which I understand is becoming a more common practice. Professional video is like a narrated CV and cover letter. So back to the project design steps. The theme of this project is the professions. And the problem we're trying to solve is preparing a portfolio that you can use in the process of looking for a job, right? In terms of the final outcome, we have the CV, the cover letter, the job interview, and the video. Now let's talk about structuring the project. Not yet, sorry. Let me show you first the CV. This is not a CV from my classroom. This is a CV from something I found on the internet. But I want to make a point about CVs. You can see that they have a lot of formulaic language, right? There's a summary, education, extracurricular activities, skills. This is formulaic language. And you can see that the language is at the phrase level. It's not really even connected sentences or even connected sentences. It's all at the phrase level. So we can put it in terms of the actual proficiency guidelines somewhere at the novice level. There's a little bit of creating with language, but very minimalistic. Moving on to the cover letter. Again, this is a cover letter I found online, but you can see that there are three kind of very minimal paragraphs. So we're now moving into the paragraph level. There's still some formulaic language, right? Dear, to open up a letter, sincerely at the end. And then there's sentences like, I hope that you will consider me for this position. You may contact me by phone at whatever. This is all formulaic language in writing a cover letter. So this puts the cover letter somewhere at the intermediate, low, mid level, because it's a fairly simple letter. Some of my students end up writing a lot more complex letters. Those could be at the intermediate, mid, advanced level. So that can vary. I'm going to say somewhere in the intermediate level. So I just went through the actual proficiency guidelines. Let's now review again the CV at the novice mid-level, formulaic language and phrases. The cover letter at the intermediate mid-level, there's still some formulaic language, and paragraphs are starting to emerge. They're creating with language. The paragraphs are still minimalistic, and the creation is just very controlled, right? Now we get to the job interview, though, at the end. The products are created sequentially. When we get to the job interview at the end, notice at that point, it's mostly non-formulaic language. You're talking. You're interacting, right? It's extended discourse. So now we're at the advanced level, and you have to deal with unexpected complications. The students will get a list of questions that they have to prepare for the interview, but when they're being interviewed, the interviewee is going to react to what they're saying and ask them to elaborate, clarify, react, etc. So that's what I mean, having to handle, when I say they're going to have to handle unexpected complications. So this is how the scaffolding works. Writing starts at the novice mid-level with the CV. It moves to the intermediate mid-level with the cover letter, and it proceeds to the advanced mid to high level with the mock job interview. Now, my students are not at the novice level. I would put them, as I said earlier, somewhere in the intermediate level, maybe the intermediate mid. So why would I have them start to work on something that is a level beneath or below what they can do? Well, because at this stage, I want them to be learning vocabulary, the vocabulary of the professions, and also the vocabulary of the job market. And so the language is simple. They can handle it very easy. It's almost at the knowledge level, but the vocabulary is not at the knowledge level. So I use this product, the CV, to teach them a lot of vocabulary. Then when they move to the letter, at that point, we're now working with cohesive language, forming paragraphs and creating with language. And by now they've learned the vocabulary through the CV. And finally, when we move to the mock job interview, they're ready to improvise with language because they now have the language that they will need to improvise, and because they've thought a lot about professional issues. I will show you this in more detail, but this is an essential idea, the fact that you scaffold the products to help students get to the most difficult of the products at the end. Well, you might still be thinking, it's still not for me. I like it, but no, my students can't do that. If that's what you're thinking, I've got something else for you. Another strategy for selecting products, and this one connects to this difference between input versus output oriented tasks. Input oriented tasks on the left of this little chart are easier. They're easier because they involve using other people's language. So let's say you find a pamphlet on the pandemic written in the target language. You could ask students to create a poster taking language from the pamphlet. You can see there's no creating there, right? There's just extracting and maybe adapting a little bit the language that has already been created by somebody else. It doesn't have to be a pamphlet. You can go from a poster to a public service announcement. That's an oral product. But the point is that if you're using somebody else's language, it's much easier than when you're on the right creating a pamphlet from information that you collect, right? Where you go and you learn about the vaccines or precautions that you can take or populations at risk. There you have to gather that information and somehow try to figure out how to turn it into a pamphlet. That's a much harder task. Similarly, with respect to the survey on the second line, if you're administering an existing survey, something somebody else wrote, or that was written in the class with the help of the teacher, that's a much easier task than creating a survey, a group of students creating a survey, and then with an interview piece, and then administering it. So if you can make this distinction between input and output oriented projects, you can see that this is a very good basis for creating projects that are accessible, input oriented tasks that are accessible to lower proficiency students. Verbs help you think about how to do this. On the left are verbs that we associate with input oriented tasks, like collecting information, organizing this information, finding more information that somebody else has written, displaying it differently, selecting pieces that you want to include and removing others, creating a list of things that you have found, etc. On the right, though, when you're writing, composing, translating, proposing, presenting, and it's your own language, those are output-oriented verbs. With lower proficiency students, we can think about creating projects that involve these kinds of verbs. With more advanced students, on the other hand, we can use tasks that start out like this, right, with input, and then are scaffolded in a way to get students to create products like this. I will show you examples of this. The bottom line for now is that there are authentic products that solve real world problems for every level of proficiency. Here's a list of them, but if you start looking around, you will find any number of them everywhere. A survey, a menu, a greeting card. By the way, survey, menu, and greeting cards are all at the intermediate low level. A marketing campaign is a little bit more complex, but you can have a marketing campaign consisting of posters at the novice high level, or public service announcements where you're reading somebody else's language. Products can also be oral. It's like having a school event where students talk or present a movie and then lead a discussion, etc. So products are everywhere, and what you need to do is think about the actual proficiency guidelines to determine the level of difficulty of the product. Back to the 3 steps, we are now ready to look at step 3 in more detail. In terms of structuring the project, you want to think about information gathering, information processing, and information reporting. Information gathering has a correlate in language acquisition research in that it connects to this idea of input, comprehensible input. You are gathering language in the target language that is accessible and that serves as the basis for the third step, which is the output. The second step, information processing, also has a correlate in second language acquisition studies, and that is a negotiation of meaning. So in the first step, you gather a lot of information, a lot of language, and then in the second step, you start thinking about how is this language going to help me? What can I take from it? How do I need to adapt it? What don't I need to worry about? That's all a negotiation of meaning phase. And finally, information reporting involves putting out language, and that correlates with the output phase of language learning. So let's look at the information gathering a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. In my class, we create a virtual center. Remember, we're writing CVs, cover letters, and preparing for a mock job interview. I'll get to the video later, which is the last product. So what goes into the center? Well, when we're working on the CVs and then later on the cover letters, we throw in a lot of CVs, authentic CVs get collected from online sites, as well as authentic cover letters. We also I learned as I was teaching this, that web page course descriptions from different university departments in the target language help a lot. So we learned that, let's say you want to talk about business and you don't have the vocabulary. We learned that if you go to, let's say, a Mexican university, the business department in the business college of business, typically in a Mexican university, you can find descriptions of courses that give you a lot of useful material, language that you can put into your CVs and your cover letter, as well as use later on in your interviews. We also learned that job announcements in Spanish are very helpful because they give us an idea of what employers want, as well as giving us the language that employers use to describe what they want. So I tell students, find those and then pick out those words that you see employers using time and time again and apply them to you. Put them in your CV, your cover letter, mention them in your job interview. When we're doing a job interview, we link to simulated job interviews online, and there's a lot of that in Spanish. If you can find some in your language, and it isn't Spanish, if your language is something other than Spanish, then great. If you can't find this kind of thing in your language, then this may not be the right project for you. It's really important to find authentic models. And then the last point is typically the one that people think of first, and that is advice on how to write a CV, a cover letter, as well as how to interview. People usually want to go, students, and frankly, I did too when I first started working on this, you want to go to the advice. But what I have learned, and what my students have learned in the process, is that the advice is not as useful as the actual models, right? The models is really what is the most concretely useful when you want to create these products. Notice that all of this involves an integrated use of technology, right? And in so, it addresses this issue that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, why PBL is so good for remote learning. Why do we need all of this? Again, because the input that is gathered using technology, the information gathering stage gives you authentic language and models, which is what you desperately need to produce the products. If you don't have models, I have to say, do not pick that project. Find another project for which you can find models. Who gathers all of this information? Well, remember, the best practices of language teaching today say that teaching should be learner-centered, and the teacher should have the role of a facilitator or a collaborator. So that means I put my students to gather this information. Of course, they don't know as well as I do where to find this information, what the search words are. And so I help them with that. That's my role as a facilitator. and as a collaborator. But really, the heavy work of collecting this information, organizing it, goes to the students. Let's move now to the information processing. Remember, this has a correlate of negotiating meaning in the language of language acquisition. Information processing is very time consuming, but it's really at the crux of learning. It's at the core of learning, so it's well worth spending a lot of time on it. This is what it involves: noticing vocabulary and grammatical constructions. So I might say, let's look at your CVs. What vocabulary comes up and time again? And of course, very obviously students will raise their hand and say education, experience, recommendations, skills, right? There are also grammatical constructions that they start to notice. If we were doing this in English, they would say, oh, they wouldn't say there are a lot of past participles, but they would catch on that there are words like worked, prepared, taught, organized, received, right? These are past participles. So they would start to notice these constructions, even if they don't know what to call them, even if they don't know how to call them past participles, they will get the idea of what it is that they have to, the kinds of constructions that they have to use. Another thing that we do during the information processing stage is compare different authentic models. And what will jump out at students, it's that some are much better than others, or much more others, and some are much more useful to them than others. So if they find a CV from a CEO, obviously that's not very useful because students are just starting out, and a CEO is somebody that has ascended to the highest levels of the business, right? So what they learn, they fine-tune the search process to find CVs or cover letters or what have you that are well suited to the task that they're going to perform, right? That are well developed and that can be adapted, can be used to their own particular situation. They also analyze forms and functions, right? What kind of language do you use to introduce yourself in an interview or to sign off in a letter? And of course, they study the conventions of each genre. In a CV, for example, the students learn that you don't write very complete sentences or paragraphs, but rather phrases. And probably one of the most important things, this is why I'm putting it in red, is that you create a rubric. I don't create the rubric. The students and myself working together co-create a rubric using the models, the CVs, the authentic cover letters that we have found. Comparing them, we come up with what is it that makes a good CV. So in doing this, students really deconstruct what a good product looks like, right? And so it's a lot more valuable than telling them how you're going to judge them, right? They are coming to an understanding of how to judge themselves against the standards, the accepted standards of the product that they're creating. So notice that this also goes along with a best practice of language teaching, and that is that students know and understand criteria and how they will be assessed by reviewing the task rubric. And now we get to the final stage, which is the information reporting stage. Remember, that goes with output in language acquisition research. Information reporting, one of the most important things to take away about information reporting is that it's broken up into small steps. By that, I mean this, that the CV is not reported to me or turned into me at the very end as a complete product, but rather it's turned in, for example, in little pieces, right? And each little piece is, for instance, it might involve headings, creating the headings first, deciding on how to order the headings. With students, maybe education is more important than experience, whereas with a CEO, the experience might be more important and would be placed higher than education, right? So we work on these little pieces at a time. So the information reporting, let's say on a CV, is done little bits at a time. Those little bits are turned into me. I assess them, mark where the problems are, and they are revised by students. And then at the very end, sure, they turn in a complete CV, but that final product is the sum of all the little steps they have created, along with the revisions that they've made. For the mock job interview, I give them 30 interview questions that they have to prepare, and they interview each other. So students will play the role of interviewee as well as interviewer, right? So they have to prepare these 30 interview questions. And some of them are very difficult. For example, a question that asks students to pick out their flaws, as we discussed earlier, is a very difficult question to answer because you don't want to sound inauthentic by saying, oh, my biggest flaw is that I work too hard or I'm too honest. That's inauthentic. But at the same time, you don't want to expose a flaw that will make you less desirable to hire, right? So that's one of the difficulties involved in coming up with the answers. Another difficulty is that the CV, the cover letter, the mock job interview, and then the video that comes at the end, and all have to hold together. They have to present you in a coherent way, present you, the potential employee, in a coherent way. So when you answer things, there has to be a narrative to all of this, your portfolio, right? So that's another thing we work on. For the interview, one of the challenges that I encountered very early on is that when students functioned as interviewers, they just read questions. They went down the list of questions and they did not react to the answers that the interviewees were given. So they have to now, the interviewers have to be reactive, and the interviewees have to be prepared to react, to handle a complication. Remember, that's a characteristic of the advanced level. We also work in class on rehearsing the interview. How do I check on all of this? The exit cards are really important. I use exit cards for students to report done in class every single time we prepare something. So, for example, if they prepare the labels, I'm going to ask them at the end of the day to turn in those labels. And then as the instructor, I give them feedback as to whether they did the task well or not. And I use that information that I get from the exit cards to set up work to come and to assign a participation grade. Let me give you more concrete examples of this. For the CV, I might ask students to look at the sample CVs in their center and make a list of 20 section labels and common verbs that go under those labels. This might get done in a 1-hour class, students working in groups by their intended professions or professional interests, right? They might have 25 CVs to look at, and they're going to figure this out and turn it in a group card. For the cover letter, this is an individual exit card we do every year. And there I ask students to answer the prompt. This is a famous prompt that was given to President John Kennedy. And so that's why it says man, but man or woman, but this was the famous words of an advisor to him. Every great man is a sentence. What is yours? So this is a very difficult task. And for a whole hour, students are working on their own in class, trying to produce a sentence that captures what it is that they want to communicate to a potential employer. And then, of course, during that hour, I ask them to read the sentence to somebody else, and they hear the sentences of their peers, and they give each other feedback. And they also look at the CV and say, well, you may say this in your sentence, but your CV doesn't show that. So at that point, they go back and they revise the CV to bring it into alignment of this idea that you want to have a coherent short story about yourself. For the mock job interview, by the way, that also comes in so that you have, again, coherence, right? But on another day, I might say to them, come up with an answer to the question of, you don't have any experience because you're a young person. Why should I hire you? So then they work in groups and they write their exit cards with the answer that they came up with. And then at the end of class, the last 15 or 20 minutes of class, I might ask each group to share their answers. And it becomes very obvious that some answers are better than others. So we talk about this and we identify the qualities of the characteristics of a good answer. I use exit cards, as I said, to set up work to come. I look over the exit cards, I underline the problems that I see with language or ideas or formatting. And then next time we meet, I talk about them. Every exit card gets a grade. That's their participation grade. So notice I'm not grading them based on how often they raise their hand, which is a rather awkward thing, and which, by the way, rewards students who are extroverts. I'm actually giving them a participation grade based on what they do in class. Some students, it's obvious when I get the individual exit card, have trouble with some points of language. Typically, the next day, after I've looked at the exit cards and I identify those students, I meet with them and give them a mini lesson on a particular point of grammar that they're having problems with, a share point of grammar. And as I do this, what is the rest of the class doing? Well, they're continuing to work on their projects. So you can see from this how well project-based learning lends itself to differentiation and learner-centered instruction. The final product, as I said earlier, is the sum of all the exit cards, but with revisions, because remember, I assess them and point out problems as we go along through each of these little pieces. Now, what about the final exam? Well, part of it is turning in this portfolio, which has to be cohesive, right? And where each product has to be high quality. And again, it has to look like an authentic product that would have been done in the Spanish-speaking world. And you will see now, for the first time, I'm really talking about the video. The video is a 3-minute professional presentation of themselves. So they have to talk using formal, rehearsed language to sort of distill the main points in their CVs and their cover letters and the mock job interviews, those main points that they think will be their most sellable points. Clearly, this can be memorized, this can be scripted, but it has to be at that point very, very polished, because it comes after these other 3 products that have served to scaffold this final product, which now is an individual product. After having worked in groups throughout the semester, they are now ready to create something on their own. And this is really the final exam. So in closing, I want to return to this idea that you can see that it works very well for HL teaching and learning, because it can be differentiated, because it really builds the functional skills that students have. It also works for language learning in general, and in mixed classes, you can see that it checks off so many boxes of the best practices of language teaching. And with respect to our current situation with the pandemic, you can see that every single one of the steps that I have presented to you can be done online. And with that, I'm going to move to summarize the points I have made. In terms of themes, think about students' everyday experiences, goals, stage of life, needs, and local issues. This will help you find themes that are meaningful to them. Describe and show by what high quality work looks like. And this is done with models, authentic models. If your students are at the novice level, find challenging problems. So problems that involve higher order thinking skills, right? Because those are the most engaging and the most likely to address a real world problem. But make sure that you pick products that can be produced with relatively little language. So products at the novice level or at the intermediate, mid, or below level. Model the different steps and components of the task, including good and bad work. You want to deconstruct that in the information processing stage of the project. You want to provide many opportunities to practice the various components and build in opportunities for critique and revision. You want to have multiple sources of feedback, not just you, but the classmates through group work, and if possible, the community, native speakers out there. You want to monitor students' progress very closely, and that's what where the exit cards come in. They turn something in every single time they work on a piece of the project. You want to have incremental deadlines, and remember, we want to construct rubrics. Above all, the most important thing you want to do is have fun, because PBL really is fun. It's fun, it's meaningful, and it just packs a punch when it comes to language learning. I thank you for listening to this presentation, and I invite you to write to me if you have questions, if you have ideas, anything that comes to mind about PBL or heritage language teaching. Also, be sure to visit us at the National Heritage Language Resource Center. Thank you very much.